You have been in that building every Sunday for 30 years, and something you cannot name what feels thinner every time you leave. The music is louder. That's true. The coffee is better. The pastor knows your name, smiles when he sees you, preaches in language that sounds like the world you actually live in. And you are grateful for all of that. You are not ungrateful, but somewhere between the parking lot and your front door, on a drive that used to feel different, there is a silence you don't know what to do with. A silence that is not peace. You have not said this to your spouse. You are not sure you could say it without sounding like you're complaining about kindness. And you are not sure if you are being honest, whether what you're feeling is a genuine spiritual perception or just the familiar ache of getting older, of preferring what was familiar, of being, at some level, the problem. That question, is this real or is this just me, is the one I want to stay with for a few minutes, because Russell Kirk had an answer to it. And his answer was precise enough that it will either confirm what you've been sensing, or it will reorganize how you understand nearly everything happening around you right now. Possibly both. Kirk spent most of his intellectual life working on a problem that sounded, at first, like a literary question. He wanted to know what separates a civilization that holds together from one that doesn't. Not what separates good politics from bad politics. He thought that was the wrong level to look at. What he wanted to understand was something prior to politics, something that happens in the mind, and then in the family, and then in the church, and only after all of that in the public square. He came to believe that the answer lived in the imagination, not imagination in the casual sense, not creativity or daydreaming. He meant something older and more specific, the capacity of the mind to perceive the moral structure of reality, whether a person or a culture is capable of seeing that persons are not isolated atoms, that the living are in debt to the dead, that liberty has a price and that price is order, that some things are permanent because they are true and not merely because they are old. He called this the moral imagination. He took the phrase from Edmund Burke, the 18th century statesman who watched the French Revolution devour its own children and understood, before almost anyone else, why. Burke saw that the revolutionaries had done something to their minds before they did anything to France. They had stripped the imagination of its capacity to perceive obligation, to see that persons are embedded in a story larger than themselves, bound to the dead who made them, and to the children who would inherit what they built or ruined. Without that perception, Burke wrote, what you get is not liberty, what you get is appetite with a flag. Kirk read Burke and spent 40 years extending that diagnosis forward. What he found by 1953, when he published The Conservative Mind, was that the moral imagination was already in retreat in America, not because anyone had declared war on it, but because a second imagination had replaced it so gradually, so comfortably, that most people had not noticed the substitution. He called this second imagination the idyllic. The idyllic imagination is not evil. That is what makes it so difficult to name, and so easy to inhabit without realizing it. It is the imagination of the person or the institution that genuinely wants things to be well, but has quietly decided that things being well means things being comfortable, that the goal of the church is for people to feel welcomed, that the goal of education is for children to feel affirmed, that the goal of a marriage is for both people to feel fulfilled, that the goal of a civilization, when you strip it down to its operating principle, is the reduction of friction. These are not wicked goals. They are incomplete ones. And Kirk argued that their incompleteness is not a small thing. It is the whole problem. The idyllic imagination, he wrote, drains reality of its weight. It imagines the human being as naturally good, naturally sociable, naturally inclined toward virtue, needing only the right environment, the right encouragement, the right therapeutic intervention. It cannot sustain tragedy. It cannot hold grief. It cannot explain why a person who has been given every comfort still comes home from church on Sunday feeling that something essential is missing. Because what is missing is not a program. What is missing is the willingness to say that the soul has obligations it did not choose, that the life of faith involves weight as well as warmth, that mystery is not a problem to be explained but a reality to be inhabited. The church that trades the weight for the welcome has not failed to be kind. It has failed to be the church. Kirk saw this substitution happening in the 1940s and 50s in mainline Protestant denominations that were, at that exact moment, reaching the peak of their cultural influence. He did not predict their decline with pleasure. He predicted it with grief. He said, An institution that abandons the hard things in order to remain relevant will find, in a generation, that it has remained relevant to a world it helped to make, and that world will not need it. The data from those denominations across the following 60 years confirmed what Kirk had seen. Membership peaked in the 1960s. It has not recovered. The institutions that remade themselves for relevance are, today, largely empty. But here is what I want you to hold before we go further. The evangelical churches that grew in their place, including, possibly, the one you attend, absorbed many of the same aesthetic and therapeutic assumptions, only with louder music and a different vocabulary. The idyllic imagination is not the property of theological liberals. It is a mode. It is available to anyone who has decided, at some level, that the primary job of the church is to make the journey easier rather than to make the traveler better, which is why you can sit in a building full of warmth and sincerity and still drive home in silence. The idyllic imagination does not feed the soul, it soothes it. And the soul, after 30 years, knows the difference. Now we arrive at the third imagination. And this is where the diagnosis becomes, I think, genuinely surprising. Kirk called it the diabolic imagination. He was not using the word casually. He took it from the Greek, diabolos, which means, literally, the one who divides. The diabolic imagination is the imagination that finds meaning in disintegration. That sees transgression not as failure, but as liberation. That experiences the destruction of the permanent things, hierarchy, obligation, sacred restraint, as a form of creativity. That cannot conceive of order without calling it oppression. Kirk traced its literary genealogy in his 1969 book, Enemies of the Permanent Things. He found it in the late Romantic decadence in writers who had grown bored with the idyllic sweetness of the early 19th century and discovered that darkness, transgression, and the aestheticization of cruelty offered a more intense sensation than comfort ever could. He named names: Baudelaire, the Marquis de Sade, Huysmans. He was not attacking them as political enemies. He was diagnosing them as symptoms. Kirk never saw the internet. He never saw a streaming platform, a social media feed, a content algorithm optimized for engagement. He could not have named them. But the principle he identified in 1860 extends, visibly, to what you are watching happen in the world your grandchildren inhabit. The content that reaches them every day, the humor that elevates cruelty, the aesthetics that celebrate nihilism, the cultural products that treat the dissolution of every constraint as a form of freedom. This is not an invasion from somewhere else. It is not a foreign ideology that landed one day and took over. It is the diabolic imagination running its course. And it arrived where it is through a sequence Kirk documented. This is what I need you to hear clearly, because it is the thing I have never seen stated plainly in the conversations this audience tends to have. The diabolic imagination is not the enemy of the idyllic imagination. It is its product. Kirk argued, in 1953, before the events that confirmed it, that the idyllic imagination carries within it the seed of its own destruction. Here is the logic. A mind trained to deny weight, to flatten tragedy, to expect comfort as its natural condition, is a mind that has been starved of genuine transcendence. And a mind starved of genuine transcendence does not simply remain comfortable. It grows hungry. It reaches, eventually, for intensity, because intensity is the only thing that still feels real to an imagination that has lost the capacity for mystery. The diabolic imagination is what the idyllic imagination produces when it runs out of sweetness to offer. This is not a metaphor. This is the mechanism Kirk identified in the literature of the 19th century and watched replicate in the culture of the 20th. The generation that was given therapeutic comfort in the place of moral weight did not, on balance, remain comforted. It produced a generation that found comfort unbearable and reached for transgression as a substitute for transcendence. Which means the question you have been asking, how did things get so bad so fast, has a more precise answer than you may have been given. Things did not get bad from outside. The sequence ran from inside, from the idyllic imagination which your institutions, including your church, inhabited for a generation, and which produced, in the generation that followed, minds without the capacity for the weight the moral imagination requires. And minds without that capacity do not stay neutral. They go somewhere. Kirk told you where. The soul before the republic. Not because the republic doesn't matter. Because the imagination governs the soul before it governs anything else. Fix the republic without reordering the imagination, and you have rearranged the furniture in a house whose foundation is shifting. Before I take this further, I want to name something practical. The three imaginations are not a verdict on the world. They are a map. And a map is only useful if you intend to go somewhere. If you've been sitting with this framework and asking yourself what you're actually supposed to do with it, not intellectually, but in the actual texture of your days, I want to point you to something I've put together that I think answers that question directly. It's called Order Your Soul First. It's a 30-day personal practice workbook, built around exactly the discipline Kirk argued is the only real alternative to the idyllic imagination: the daily, deliberate cultivation of the moral imagination. 30 days, one practice per day, each one anchored to a specific Kirkian concept, not as abstract philosophy, but as a reflection question and a prompt you can actually use before your morning gets away from you. The video gives you the name. If you want the daily framework for what comes after naming, the link is in the description. That is where the map becomes a practice. Now, the climax. I said earlier that a name isn't enough, that knowing the sequence, moral, idyllic, diabolic, doesn't yet explain why no one around you seems to be able to see it. Why the people you love, the people who are, by any measure, good people, look at the same world you look at, and do not seem to feel the same alarm. Here is why. The idyllic imagination does not announce itself. It presents as kindness. It presents as inclusion, as welcome, as the reasonable softening of unnecessary harshness. It looks, from the inside, like maturity, like having grown past rigidity, past the need to make everything so serious, past the kind of religion that scared people away. It feels, from the inside, like warmth. And so when you sense that something is missing, when the drive home is too quiet, the idyllic imagination has a ready explanation for your discomfort. You are the one who hasn't adjusted. You are the one holding on to something that doesn't serve anyone anymore. You are, at some level, the problem. This is the internal logic that makes the sequence so difficult to interrupt. The idyllic imagination does not merely replace the moral imagination. It diagnoses the moral imagination as the illness. And here is what I need you to hear, very directly. Your grief is not nostalgia. Nostalgia is the desire to return to something because it was familiar. What you have been feeling is different. It is the perception, accurate, documented, Kirk confirmed, that something real has been lost. Not something comfortable, something true. The capacity of an institution and of a culture, and perhaps of a mind, to hold the weight of what is actually asked of a human being. Obligation, transcendence, the long story that includes the dead and the unborn, and to call it not a burden, but a home. When you walk out of that building on Sunday and the drive home is quiet, you are not failing your faith. You may be the most faithful person who left that parking lot because you are still asking the question the idyllic imagination taught everyone else to stop asking. Kirk called the moral imagination a capacity, not a conclusion you reach once and then possess. A capacity, which means it can be cultivated and it can atrophy. And the choice between those two trajectories is made in very small increments on very ordinary days, mostly in the interior of a person's life, long before it becomes visible anywhere else. He made that choice himself. He built a house called Piety Hill in a small Michigan town. He filled it with books, with students, with people who needed somewhere to think. He married late at 45, and he buried his children's friend in the family cemetery because the boy had no one else who would. He lived as though the permanent things were real, not as a demonstration, as a practice. What he built there and what he wrote across 4 decades was not a political program. It was a counter-imagination, the deliberate daily insistence on perceiving the moral structure of reality, even when the institutions around him had quietly stopped asking whether such a structure existed. This is not nostalgia, this is civilization, and it begins. It has always begun. Not in Washington, not in the courts, not in the culture war's latest theater. It begins in the question you ask yourself before the day takes over. In the silence on the drive home. In the refusal to let that silence be explained away. The question that remains, and I am leaving it small because it is the right size for something you will carry with you, is not, which imagination governs the culture? You know the answer to that. Kirk knew it in 1953. The question is, which imagination are you cultivating today in the hours no one sees? That is a different question. It is a smaller question, and it is the only question that is actually yours to answer. Tell me, when you walk out of church on Sunday, What does the silence on the drive home feel like? And have you ever been able to say why?